Yeah, this is a poem I came to late in life. I mean, I was already well a poet and had been reading and writing and poetry, and for some reason I kind of skipped right over Edna St. Vincent Millay. I just didn't know really. I mean, I'd heard her name, but I didn't really know who she was. And one day my husband was reading something, and he said, "Wow, listen to this poem," and he read me this poem. I said, "Who wrote that?" He said, "Edna St. Vincent Millay." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Let me see that," and I grabbed the book from him and I kept reading it and reading it. I don't know, it just struck me. And then I wanted to read more Edna St. Vincent Millay, so I went and started reading her poems. And of course, I didn't even know I knew the famous kind of like, I keep my candle, I burn at both ends, and whatever. But it was her other poems that got to me. For instance, "I Am Not Resigned." I mean, again, kind of not a typical what we think of when we think of Edna St. Vincent Millay. Just like O'Hara, we don't think of him as writing something like you just read, right? And when you hear this poem, you don't think immediately, "Oh, that must be Edna St. Vincent Millay," because we haven't been exposed to all her work. But it made me want to know more about her, and so I went and got the biography, Savage Beauty, and read that. And I loved the poem, but after I read the biography, it made the poem new for me. So I'll tell you about that after I read it. This is called Assault. Like violence, assault. I had forgotten how the frogs must sound after a year of silence. Else I would not have ventured forth alone at dusk upon this unfrequented road. I am waylaid by beauty, who will walk between me and the crying of the frogs. O savage beauty, suffer me to pass, that am a timid woman on her way from one house to another. And I loved the poem. To tell you the truth, I'm not even sure exactly why I loved it. I loved the way it sounded. I loved the idea of frogs being silent for a year, and this woman alone on a road, and this idea of savage beauty, that beauty could actually be terrifying, and the use of the word suffer, suffer me to pass, and the timidity, of this woman on her way from one house to another. And of course, I'm thinking of, from the house of life to the house of death, or from the house of the one alone spiritual being in the house of God, or the higher spiritual being, the house of the single to the house of the many. It could be many things. I saw the metaphor and loved that. And then I read Savage Beauty, which is about her life. And I realized that she had grown up as a young girl with her sisters in a house. And her mother, the father was gone, and the mother was a nurse. So she would go off when there were big outbreaks of different kinds of plagues, and Maine. And so the mother would be gone for sometimes days, weeks at a time, tending to the wounded or to, the suffering. And the girls would be left on their own. And they had their jobs to do. Each one of them had a job. One would take care of the fire. One would cook the breakfast. One would clean. One would sew. And they had different times of day that they did all these things. I love that they had the reading hour where they would all read, and then they had the play hour where they would all act out what they had read. And then somebody would make lunch. Somebody would clean, and they just had their days organized this way, completely alone, as very young girls. They're, 8, 9, and 10 or something. And the nearest neighbor were their aunts, who lived down a long forested road. And so if anything happened, which one night it did, some loggers came by and they'd heard there were 3 young girls living alone in this house. So they went around and they banged on the doors and the windows to scare them. And they were terrified, as you can imagine. And but if anything happened, if they needed something or someone was sick, they had to walk 5 miles to get to their aunt's house. So they really were in the middle of nowhere. So now I'm reading the poem again, and I'm thinking of Edna as a young girl, as a 10-year-old girl, walking down the road alone to an aunt's house, right? And I'm thinking it's a completely different poem when you think about it in terms of, what's actually going on. But of course, it doesn't ruin the first reading. I just know something about it now that delights me to know, but I didn't need to know it to know the poem. And the poem is actually, in some ways, larger, not knowing that, but also in some ways it's enlarged by knowing that when I think of her as a young girl and keeping that memory of that terror all those years, and then eventually writing a poem about that time in her life. So I'll just say it once again so you can hear it with little Edna at 10 years old in the cold, walking past the forest to her aunt's house. Assault. I had forgotten how the frogs must sound after a year of silence. Else I would not have ventured forth alone at dusk upon this unfrequented road. I am waylaid by beauty, who will walk between me and the crying of the frogs. O savage beauty, suffer me to pass, that am a timid woman on her way from one house to another.